Look, Wolverine, you've got less than a minute remaining.
Mr. Barney, thank you out. He said you got less than a minute. What does it mean when I say derive?
You say what?
Derive.
Derive?
Derive. What does derive mean? Good morning, Kimmy.
Strive.
So when I say derive the value of I to the first power to I to the eighth power, what does that mean? Find it. And I said without using your notes. Basically what I'm asking you to do is prove what the value is using mathematical operations. Prove what the value is using mathematical operations. So I would like you to use what you know, which is basically I equals what?
-1.
The square root of -1. If I equals the square root of -1, take me through all the way 8 to the first power to 8 to the 8th power. Myself on the Have you got it all the way done? You need a starting place? No? Okay, so let's look at it. So if we look at it, what is I to the first power?
Square root of negative
I to the second power?
1. Or wait, 1. Yeah, so
Okay, so I hear 1. Do I have any different opinions? So I to the second power is simply I times I, which is equal to the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. Anytime you square a radical, the radical goes away and the only thing that's left is the radicand. The radicand is the number that is underneath the radical. So is it 1? What's under the radical?
Attention teachers, staff, please allow students not for 11th grade down with the last name of N through Q. Thank you.
N through Q. Not yet, Josh.
I kind of forgot it. I do. I didn't figure it. I don't know what she was on first day or something.
So it is simply the square root of negative 1 squared. So all the radical is going to go away and all you're left with what's underneath. So what's underneath?
Negative.
Negative 1. So it should be negative 1. Then I to the third power.
Negative 1 times, wait. Negative 1 outside the square root of negative 1.
I agree. So it's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. So negative square root of 1 times the negative square root of 1, we've already said is what? So we can simplify this to not negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which is equal to what, Markel? Yes. So negative square root negative 1. All I'm asking you to do when I say derive is prove it mathematically given what you know. You know that the identity of I is equal to the square root of -1. So then I to the 4th power is equal to the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. If we group it, what does this equal? What does that equal? -1 times -1, +1. Have you got 5 through 8 done? Everybody, that's 5 through 8?
Just the same thing.
But I want you to step me through it to prove it. So I to the 5th power, what is I to the 5th power?
Square root of -1 times 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 square root of -1.
Yes.
If you can prove that I exists, why does it not have
I is, so it is in computer programs. But the calculator is a one-dimensional. I is two-dimensional. Remember that video we watched? So we have -1 times -1 is times a -1 times a -1. I mean, times this.
-1.
So you got -1 here, -1 here. That turns out to be what?
+1.
And then times,
Square root of -1. So square root of
yes. I want you to be able to derive and defend what the square root, what I to any power is. Derive and defend. What about I to the 6th power? So what you could do is I to the 3rd times I to the 3rd. So that would be I to the 3rd was what? Negative square root -1 times negative square root -1. So let's take care of the radicals first. And that would be a -1. So then, and then you've got 2 negatives on the outside. So this will be positive -1, which is equal to
maybe something positive and then -1 square root of -1 times square root of -1 equals -1.
so positive times a -1. So view these as -1 times -1 is equal to a positive
1.
times -1. Positive 1 times -1 is -1. Does that make sense, Trey?
Yeah.
Okay. Out of the 7. Simply -1 times -1, or times Square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. Grouping, we've got negative 1, negative 1, negative 1, and the square root of negative 1. So negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 is negative 1 times square root of negative 1 is and then your last one, I to the 8th power. It's going to be exactly what I to the 7th was. It'll be negative. So if we say I to the 7th times I, which is equal to negative times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 is times this negative on the outside. Anytime you're asked to derive, it means to prove it. So anytime you're asked to derive, it means to prove it. With that being said, we're going to look more at complex numbers today. So if you look at the number 5 plus 2i, we call 5 plus 2i a complex number because it has a real piece and an imaginary piece. We're on page 21. A real piece, and imaginary piece. So your real piece is this 5 right here. And the imaginary piece is the 2i. Very important, very important, very important. The standard form of a complex number is always written a plus bi, where a is the real component and bi is the imaginary component. Very important. When you enter your solution, it should always be in the standard form, a plus bi. Now, with that being said, how can we simplify the terms below? You can add them and subtract them just like you would variables. You add and subtract your real component, and you add and subtract your imaginary component. So let's look. Our real component first. We've got negative 11 plus 9. Negative 11 plus 9 is what? Negative 2. Now let's look at our imaginary component. We have plus 3i plus 2i. What is 3i plus 2i? We're adding. So this will be plus 5i. Is it in standard form? Yeah. It's in standard form, so here we go. That's our solution, or our simplified term. Because they're not asking us to solve. They're asking us to simplify. What about number 2? 4 plus I plus 7 minus 5I. 4 plus 7.
11.
Attention teachers and staff, please allow students down with the last name R through S, and that will be for 9th through 11th grade. Thank you.
That's why I think
So we have 4 plus 7. Yes. 4 plus 7 is 11, and then I minus 5I. Just combining your real terms and your imaginary terms. You do number 3 and 4. Take 4. When you get done, write it on your whiteboard so that you can present. all a good time this long weekend? No, ate too much pizza. Oh,
I'll say that Friday was fun, but Saturday. We had challenge. Saturday and Sunday.
you did what?
I stayed up late for like
Okay.
no. Who's two?
Where was it? All right, Josh, will you present number 3 for us?
3 to 7.
You have to go up front so I can't even see.
So I did 7 minus 2. Pretty sure it'd be minus 2 because that minus that's 5, and then you add the negative 2 under 6i, it's 4i.
Okay.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did.
So 7 minus 2 is what?
5.
Okay. And negative 2 minus 6i is,
The minus 6i.
why did I say minus 6i? What negative, Brady? Exactly. So you would multiply this negative, you got to distribute that. So I agree with the 5, but the minus 2i minus 6i would be what? What's minus 2 minus 6? Yep, there you go. So do you agree with that? Perfect. It'll blind you on it. So is that what y'all got?
Yeah.
All right. So what about number 4? Frank, will you present?
I'll try. I kind of lost my voice.
I'm right there with you, that's why I'm trying to get y'all.
I yelled a lot at the rest because they kind of didn't know how football worked.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Friday night. And I yelled at Jake because Jake's just a baller. So, you got your problem. Then you distribute the negative into that, which is negative 14 plus I, then that will stay the same. And then you just factor it basically. Yeah, well, not factor it. You just
Combine like that.
combine like terms to get negative 9 plus 4i.
Anybody get anything different?
Yeah.
What'd you get, Jay?
I got 19 plus 4i.
Okay, so let's look at what Braden did and see where the 19 may have come from. Is it a positive 19 or a negative 19 that you have?
Positive.
Distribute the negative.
You see it?
Oh, you got negative 9. I got positive.
So is that right?
So you gotta distribute that negative outside the 14 minus I. So everything that's inside the parentheses. Excellent job, Braden.
Thanks.
So the answer, negative 9 plus 4i, is that what you got, Braden? All right. What about multiplying?
Wait, yeah. How the heck you do that? 4i.
Okay, so we've got
This is
So if you
If you distribute the negative, it would be positive I, then combined, that would make it 3.
6i,
7 minus 3 would make it.
7 minus 3.
Sorry.
Yeah, 6 and all on the outside shape. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I forgot to say Tom.
okay. So when you're multiplying complex numbers, it's very important, very important, very important that you remember that I squared is equal to a -1. It's imperative that you remember that. Okay? So when you're looking at I squared is equal to a -1, and we're multiplying complex numbers, it's going to be the exact same thing as we've done before. It's just that we're dealing with imaginary numbers, which are really not imaginary numbers. They're called lateral numbers, correct?
Attention teachers and staff, please allow students grade 9 through 11 down with the last name T through W at this time. Thank you.
So now you have just distributing this 2i to each number in the parentheses. You've got 2i times 8, which is what? 16i. Then you have 2i times a -3i.
6i squared. Negative 6i squared.
Yes. Now we're going to plug in our I squared. So that's going to give us 16i minus 6 times a -1. What's that going to be? 16i plus 6. And to write it in standard form, what do I have to do?
6 plus 16i. Just
Exactly.
please let these expressions in the quiz.
What?
It's so easy.
I have a sinus infection, which
Yeah, I know. I'm pretty sure I got that. So
is doing a number on my chest.
I fell asleep with my mouth wide open last night. I just woke up, my throat was hurting so bad.
Last year, we were coughing, I was coughing so bad, and then I was good, and I had to sit out. It was our last home game, I had to sit out marching during my time. So mad.
Yeah, I normally get sick with allergies and I have asthma. And so it tends to turn into this in my chest. And so when it's in the fall and in the spring, I get this every single year. So what is -I minus 2? And I've checked my temperature over and over and over. I have no fever. It's just allergies. So -I times a -2. 2i. And then -I times a positive 10i. -10i squared, exactly. And so now we're going to recall this little note over here. I squared is equal to -1. So we have 2i minus 10 times a -1. And -10 times a -1, positive 10. And then how do I finish it in standard form? Plus 2i. Exactly. Perfect, perfect.
So standard form is always going to be close, right?
No, standard form is always going to be the real number plus or minus the imaginary number. That's the most important part. A plus BI. Because look up here, Jake, it's 5 minus 8i. That's why I say that. What happens when we have a binomial? Pull it out. Exactly, pull it out. So 7, we're going to do first, outer, inner, last. Our first term is what? Our outer term. Our inner term. And then our last term. Yes, thank you. Tag team there. Minus I squared. So now we are going to put in what we know our I squared is and combine like terms. We know I squared is a -1, so we're going to say minus a -1, just plugging in the value of I squared. -7i plus 4i is equal to, yep. And so we've got 28 plus 1. Do you see where the plus 1 came from, Jake?
Yeah.
Okay. Brayden, where did the -3i come from? Excellent. Take 3. And do 8 and 9 on your own. Make sure you write your answers on your whiteboard so that you can explain. All right. Ms. Barnhill, will you walk us through number 8? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so number 8, first I searched for my friends, got -10 plus 20i minus 6i plus 12i squared, and then combined the right terms, -10 plus 14i plus 12i squared, and then factored the I squared into the plus 12, got -12. So -10 plus 14i minus 12, and then -10 minus 12 is 22, so -22, so -22 plus 14i.
Anybody get anything different? Perfect. All right. Ms. Paisley, will you walk us through number 9? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
So 6 squared is 36, and -2i squared is -4i squared. And then you can turn the I squared into -1. So then you just get 36 plus 4, which is 4.
So on number 8, we had -22 plus 14i. Is that right? And then on number 9, we had 36.
The teachers and staff, please allow students grade 9 through 11 down with the last name of X through Z. And we also ask that any remaining students that haven't had their picture made come up, that's grade 9 through 11. Seniors, just remember you have scheduled time to come up during the day. Thank you.
Paisley, what was your answer again? Sorry. 40. Did anybody get anything different? What did you get, Jay?
I got 36 minus
36 minus what? 20i. All right, so let's step through it. We have 6 minus 2i times 6 minus 2i. 6 times 6 is minus 2i times 6. Six times a minus 2i. And then minus 2i times minus 2i. Combine like terms, we've got 36 minus 24i. Add our, plug in our -1, so 4 times the -1 is 36 minus 4 is? There you go. Jake, do you see where you went wrong? Paisley, do you see where you missed these middle terms? No worries. We are all learning. How could I even begin number 10?
In the first half with foil, then with foil, yeah.
Okay, exactly. So we have to remember our order of operations. We have to do PEMDAS first. Parentheses, exponents, multiplication. So this is multiplication is going to come first. So if I FOIL this out, my first term is going to be 1 times 9, which is my outer term, 1 times 3i. My inner term is 7i times 9. My last term is 7i plus 3i. Yes, thank you. And now we can distribute this negative. Negative 4 minus 2i. If we combine like terms, we have 3i plus 63i minus 2i. Yeah. We have plus 21i squared. And we have plus 9 minus 4, which is if we plug in our negative 1 for our I squared, what's that going to make that 21? Negative 21. So 5 minus 21 is? Does that make sense?
I think it's 64. 63 plus 3 minus 2.
You just finished FOIL on that side.
Minus 2. Yeah.
So 64 came from 3i plus 63i minus 2i.
Oh, you did all of it together?
Yes. But Paisley, did you ask a question?
Can you just finish doing FOIL and then combine it?
Yes. So if when you say finish it in FOIL, do you mean
Like simplify that side.
give me a minute. So we had, what was that line that we just had? Say that again.
In parentheses, 1 plus, wait, what do you want?
That first line after FOIL.
Oh, okay, so 9 plus 3i plus 63i plus 21i squared minus 4 minus 2i. 6.
And wasn't it plus 2i like that in the problem?
Yeah. But it's 6.
So yeah, you could combine this first. You could say 9 plus 66i plus 21i squared minus 4 plus 2i. Do you want to plug in your I squared here? Or you want to wait till the end? Do it there, Marco. So 9 minus 21 negative 12 plus 66i. Now we're going to distribute this negative. So we have minus times a 4.
Minus 4, minus 2.
So negative 12 minus 4. 66i minus 2i. So yeah, I mean, you can do it either way. Most important thing is you multiply first. Most important thing is you multiply first. All right, so let's look at, bless you. Let's look at a concept called complex conjugate. Complex conjugate. So a complex conjugate is simply two complex numbers that are exactly the same but have opposite signs. So you have a plus bi, a minus bi. That would be a complex conjugate. So if we look at number 11, we're going to prove that the product of a complex conjugate is always a real number. Always a real number, which means, what's the opposite of real? Imaginary. In math, imaginary, right? So let's look at this and see if we can prove it. Boil it out. 8 times 8. 8 times a negative I. 8 times a positive I. And then negative I times a positive I. When you combine like terms, what happens to your middle terms? They cancel out. When something cancels out, what do we say it equals to? 0. And so we're left with 64 minus I squared. If we plug in our negative 1 for our I squared, what is that going to give us?
64.
So it'll be 64 minus a negative 1, which is going to equal to what? 64 minus a negative 1. You agree? Unit number 12, take 2. Write it on your whiteboard when you get done so you can consider. Brayden, you want to present?
So first, let's make my blank. You pull out to get 25 minus 20i plus 20i minus 16i squared. You do 16, I did negative 16 I squared, which would be negative 16 times negative 1, which gives you 16, which gives you 25 plus 16.
You want to do that?
Yeah.
80 can read anything. She's absent. Yes, one, two,
Yeah, I'll make these announcements. So what was your answer, Brayden?
41.
41. When we
lost Cammy again.
Where did she even come back? I was gonna say she's into it from last day. Yeah. But I think with just softball. Yeah. Oh, we got moved.